I recognize that there are probably a lot of people who are here who grew up in the neighborhood that I'm going to be talking about. And so I hope that this is interesting to you, and I look forward to hearing more from you after. Jacob Rothschild. There was a very brief discussion of Jewish neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, speaking specifically about where the Rothschild family lived and where Rabbi Rothschild grew up in Pittsburgh. And the story that was told then of Jewish neighborhoods in Pittsburgh where a Jewish community would settle in a neighborhood that's very close to a downtown business district and then would, as a group, move along with their institutions to a neighborhood, a residential neighborhood that was a little bit more upwardly mobile, and then over the course of decades out to the suburbs. That's certainly the Atlanta story too. There's really no difference. And so let me give you guys a sense. Wait a second, my screen is not, hold on. Oh, there we go. So here's a, hoping there won't be too many technical glitches here. Here's a satellite shot of Atlanta. For those of you who know Atlanta, be familiar. Those who don't, perhaps you can orient yourself by Hartsfield-Jackson Airport to the south and west of Atlanta, sort of city central. But today, the vast majority of Atlanta's Jewish residents and also their institutions are located in the neighborhoods and the suburbs to the north and east. So closer in town, places like Buckhead and Emory University, and even closer in town, places like Virginia Highlands, but further out, Toco Hills and Brookhaven, and then certainly Sandy Springs and Dunwoody, Roswell and Alpharetta. These are all neighborhoods where Jews and Jewish institutions are sort of clustered today. But the neighborhood that I'm going to be talking about today is here, just south of the Central Business District, a neighborhood that we're going to refer to as the South Side. Let me give you a sense of what that neighborhood looks like today. So these are the streets that I'm going to be talking about now, but in a lot of ways, those streets have been kind of erased by massive infrastructure programs like the interstate. This is what you can see here is the downtown connector going north-south and running into this massive interchange between 7585 and I-20 that goes east and west. And also you can see here two, well, the footprint, I guess you could say, of two big sports facilities. To the north is the Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, which was where the Braves first played when it was built in 1965, 1966. And then just to the south was the Centennial Olympic Stadium, which was where the 1996 Olympic opening and closing ceremonies took place. And then it was where the Braves played until they moved out to Cobb County. And now it's the football stadium for Georgia State University, which is my own institution. And so this neighborhood today is really, it's highways, interstate highways, big stadiums, and parking lots surrounded close in by poverty, impoverished neighborhoods, primarily impoverished African-American neighborhoods that are currently going through a process of gentrification. But just to give you guys some sense of what this neighborhood used to look like, here are some of the major streets of the Jewish neighborhood at the time, all the way to the west, Pryor Street, which along with Central Avenue and Pulliam Street, which were the streets to the west, were really the center of Sephardic Jewish life in Atlanta for several decades. And I learned a lot about that through the research of Dan and Mimi Maslia, who have done this work through Orvis Shalom. And I don't know if Dan and Mimi are on this call, but if you've ever had a chance to see their research, it's phenomenal. The central street running east-west is Georgia Avenue, which was kind of the main business district for the South Side that served both Black and white communities. to the south, Atlanta Avenue, which was, I've heard referred to as the north side of the south side, which meant it was a little bit more posh, I guess, upscale, than a lot of the other homes in the neighborhood. The central north-south running street was Washington Street, and then all the way to the east, Capitol Avenue. And those both were streets where there were residences of lots of different kinds. There were lots of Jewish institutions and other kinds of institutions on Capitol Avenue, municipal institutions like the Piedmont Hospital, which was in fact founded on the South Side in the late 19th century by an Austrian Jewish immigrant named Ludwig Amster. So speaking of institutions, one of the things that I've realized as I've been studying this neighborhood, you can see how there would be no evidence of the Jewish past in this part of town today. It's really hard to see, as opposed to someplace like the Lower East Side of New York City, and you can see that there's still, like, the Forward building still has Yiddish writing along the side. There's nothing like that here. And so you really have to do excavation work, not actually digging, but to try and get a sense of what it used to look like. And so here are some of the institutions that were located in this neighborhood. The map that you're looking at here, you can see that it was, very much an urban grid. And we'll come back to this map in a few moments. But in the meantime, you can see where all of these Jewish institutions were and what they looked like. And you can see that some of them were phenomenally grand, like the Hebrew Orphans Home and the Temple, the Hebrew Benevolent Congregation. Some of them were a little bit more modest, like Anshe Sfard, which is a large home, but it seems like when this picture was taken, it had seen better days. And then the Arbiter Ring Shul, which looks like it was in a cottage. But these were all of the Jewish institutions that were in this neighborhood between 1920 and some even earlier, up to about 1950. And this is what's there now. You can see that it's mostly highways, occasionally parking lots. That you could, in one space, there is a home here. I think that home was built after the Olympics. You could see where the Hebrew Orphans Home had once been. There is, you can see the stadium off to the side and other evidence of the Olympics that took place there in 1996. But by and large, it is a place for cars, either to go fast or to park. So, what happened is the question that I've been asking of this neighborhood. And my goal for our talk today is to recount the process by which Jews moved into and then out of the South Side neighborhood of Atlanta. Now, these processes, both moving in and moving out, they were, both influenced by internal and external forces. Internal forces, for instance, being if one's Jewish institution, like your synagogue, moves out of the neighborhood, and it seems more likely that Jewish residents who have remained behind will also move to that neighborhood. But for today, I'm going to focus on the process by which at this section of town and Atlanta more generally became a racially segregated city, and how the South Side was affected by that process. So, to go all the way back to the beginning of Atlanta, this neighborhood, this map, I should warn you that I'm going to be using a lot of old historic maps, which I find are really helpful and give you a sense of space. But I know that there can be a lot of information in these maps, so I'll do my best to explain some things. The map that we're looking at here is an 1883 map of the city, and the circle is the city limits. And the blue rectangle that I have placed there, that's the South Side. That's the neighborhood we're talking about. And the South Side was part of Atlanta's oldest residential neighborhood. It was founded, it and the neighborhood directly to the east, and both neighborhoods to the east and west, were founded just after the Civil War. Just to the east, in the section that's green, African Americans moved to this neighborhood to establish their own churches and schools and other kinds of institutions, and also to live in their own neighborhoods. That neighborhood just to the east was known as Summerhill. Similarly to the west, a neighborhood was founded that was known as Mechanicsville. And both of those neighborhoods still exist today. But in the section that is circled in blue, that was a part of town where white elite and middle-class Atlantans began to move in the 1870s. As a matter of fact, along Washington Street was one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the city in the late 19th century. I believe that the governor lived there, but a lot of very successful merchants, businessmen, city officials lived along Washington Street and in that neighborhood in general. And in the 1880s, Atlanta's Jewish community began to move into this neighborhood as well. German Jewish community began to move into this neighborhood. Central European Jews who had lived in Atlanta, had been settled in Atlanta since before the Civil War, since the 1840s. By the 1880s, the Central European Jews, these German Jews, had started moving into the South Side. As a matter of fact, Leo and Lucille Frank lived in this neighborhood. If you look down, I've put a little house marker there. That was the location of the home that Leo and Lucille Frank were living in 1913 when Leo Frank was arrested and tried for murder. Around the 1910s, Eastern European Jews, most of whom had been living in a neighborhood to the north, just closer to the central business district, but just a little bit to the north and east along Decatur Street. Central European Jews had really clustered in that neighborhood, but in the 1910s, they also started to move down to the South Side neighborhood and living along the same streets, and also bringing their institutions into this neighborhood as well. And then in the 1920s, Sephardic Jews also moved into this neighborhood on the west side of the neighborhood and joined them. And at this point, they're also being joined by other immigrant groups, primarily Greek Atlantans and Syrian Atlantans. And Greek Atlantans moved to mostly along the same streets as Sephardic Jews were living, so on the west side around Pryor Street. And Syrian Atlantans were living in the north side of this neighborhood. So by the 1920s, this is really not only Atlanta's sort of densest and most robust Jewish neighborhood, but it's a dense and robust immigrant neighborhood. But Jews and immigrants are still very much in the minority in this part of town. So they're living amongst native-born Black and white Atlantans, in addition to the growing immigrant communities as these communities are having American-born children. This was an incredibly diverse neighborhood, as I said, although I want to make clear that when I say diverse, I don't mean integrated. It was racially mixed. I guess you could say it was an interracial neighborhood, but it was definitely not an integrated neighborhood. It was African Americans lived mostly on the east side of this part of the city, but they were also sort of dotted throughout the South Side neighborhood. Let me give you, there's also I should say, mixing not only of races, but also of classes. This is a neighborhood where very rich people lived and also very poor people lived. Here's a set of images that I collected from this neighborhood. So you can see that there are homes of a wide range of style. There's the Jacobus family home on Washington Street, which has, it's got the multiple chimneys and the turrets, and it's sort of a Victorian mansion. A more modest bungalow over on Crew Street. And the neighborhood also had a lot of smaller, more cottagey single family homes, duplexes, apartment buildings, increasingly mansions and large homes that were being subdivided into flats, in addition to some I could really only call shacks in alleys, sort of 1 and 2 room, very small lean-tos often that didn't have any indoor plumbing or electricity, and that was primarily those sorts of structures were lived in almost entirely by the neighborhood's poorest African Americans, though there were also some Black homeowners, both in the South Side and in Summerhill to the east. You can see here that there's a range of stores too on Martin Street. That's Saul Scher's Market. It is called Summerhill Market, and because it's in sort of the heart of Summerhill, and so it stands to reason that most of his clientele would have been the Black residents of Summerhill. There's Siegel's Kosher Market over on Washington Street, one of several kosher markets in that area. And his clientele wouldn't have only been Jews, but certainly Jews who were seeking kosher goods would have been able to find them there. And David Mesra's Grocery over to the west on Central Avenue. David Mesra was a Sephardic Jew, and I heard from a Greek person who I interviewed, who lived, a person of Greek descent who grew up in that neighborhood, that his grocery was where you could find the good feta cheese reliably. So clearly his clientele are both Sephardic Jews and the Greeks who live in the neighborhood, as well as other local residents. I also want to share this. This is one of my favorite pictures in the world, a picture of Jack and Mitzi, his sister, Mitzi Rosenberg. They're on Georgia Avenue. You can see the stores behind them, but their Ford two-door that he's sitting on is in front of his father's grocery store. And in back of his father's very small sort of a convenience store is the house that they live in. So there's a lot of different kinds of structures. It's, I guess, today we would call it mixed use, and it's the kind of neighborhood that urbanites and people who are interested in like the new urbanism think it makes for a healthy neighborhood where people are able to do a lot of stuff on foot and find the groceries and the services that they need locally. So this was what the neighborhood looked like, just to get some sense of what the neighborhood looked like back in the 1920s, 1930s. So this is really where our story starts, because it's in the I guess you could say the 19-teens, but especially in the 1920s, when neighborhoods like the South Side, neighborhoods that are older, and neighborhoods where there's a mix of residential and commercial and even industry. There was some light industry in the neighborhood as well, and it wasn't very far from the railroad tracks. The neighborhoods like this were beginning to come into disfavor. This kind of hodgepodge of uses was regarded as bad urban planning. I guess this is sort of the era of the beginning of the very idea of urban planning in the United States. And these kinds of neighborhoods were regarded as a problem for public health, a problem for the value of real estate. And so the city starts trying to think about how it can solve some of these problems. And one of the things that they do is they develop a city planning commission, and that planning commission develops a set of zoning recommendations. And here are 3 of the recommendations that were made. The first is that the city zone separate uses into separate neighborhoods so that a residential district would only be homes and there wouldn't be any commerce or any kind of industry there. And a commercial district would be only shops, and people would not live in that kind of neighborhood. But the problem for the South Side is that it already had all of those things. It already had a lot of different kinds of residences. It already had a lot of commerce and a little bit of light industry. So already you can see that the South Side's general makeup is going to fall into disfavor according to these new ideas of what makes a healthy city. The second recommendation is that single family homes be zoned apart from multi-family rental housing, because it was believed at the time that that being next to an apartment building hurt real estate values for single family homes. And also there was a sense that people of higher class and people of lower class shouldn't live in the same neighborhoods, that it would be bad for social stability. And so this was a way to keep people of different classes apart by determining the kinds of residential structures that were allowed to be in any particular neighborhood. But the South Side already has a wide range of owned property, rental property, single family, multifamily. So already the infrastructure of the neighborhood is again falling and under these new recommendations are going to be bad for the South Side. And finally, the belief that cities should be zoned with racial segregation in mind, in the interest of the public good. Again, the belief for public peace and social stability. It's worth keeping in mind that in 1906, there had been a riot, what's sometimes referred to as the 1906 Atlanta race riot, which was really a massacre of African Americans all around Atlanta that lasted for about 3 days. So that would have been very heavy in the mind of city planners who believed the goal should be to keep people apart, and that's how to maintain the public peace. But as you can see in this map here, the South Side is already a mixed neighborhood. So let me just explain what we're looking at right now. This is a map based on the 1940 census. And it's a map of the neighborhood we're talking about. And so the yellow squares are the Jewish institutions that we've already looked at that, where they were all placed. And you can see here that as the lighter the square, the higher proportion of white people live on that block, and the darker the square, the higher proportion of African Americans live in that block. And so you can see that the South Side is, first of all, surrounded on all sides by African American neighborhoods, but it itself is also a racially mixed neighborhood. So clearly the South Side is going to be increasingly regarded as a neighborhood that is kind of a problem. So how did the South Side's Jews respond to these developments? Well, one of the ways that they did was by leaving. Those who could afford it started to move, and this is primarily German Jews, Central European Jews, and their descendants. So we have also quite a few native-born Jews who have achieved enough economic upward mobility that they are able to purchase homes in the suburbs that are being built to the north of the city, in neighborhoods like Ainsley Park, Inman Park, Morningside, and Druid Hills. And as this population, as this group starts to move into these suburbs, which have been built for white people only, and they often contain statements, restrictive covenants within their contracts, the real estate contracts, that say that only a Caucasian person can purchase a home or live in that home. A very few of these restricted covenants had also specified that only Christians could live in these homes, but by and large, they did not restrict Jews. And so Jews who could afford it were moving to the suburbs. And the premier Jewish institutions in that neighborhood, German Jewish institutions, the Standard Club and the Temple, had to figure out how to respond to that. And as a matter of fact, Rabbi David Marks, who was the leader of the Temple at that time, starting in around 1921, every year in his beginning of the year sermon would tell the congregation, our community is moving north, our membership is moving north. And the more people who move there, the less convenient our location will be for them. So we need to move north too. So by 1930, the Standard Club, which was the elite social club for Atlanta's Jews, that club had moved up to I guess you would say probably the Druid Hills neighborhood, up onto Ponce de Leon. And the temple had also by 1930 or so had, actually by 1928, I think had actually sold its property to the Greek Orthodox church in town. And so that's kind of interesting. You can see that, you know, an older immigrant group leaves and a newer immigrant group comes and actually like establishes its own use in the exact same, not just along the same streets, but in the exact same building. But by 1930 or so, both of those institutions had left. And at the same time, other immigrant groups, more recent groups like Eastern European Jews, and as I said, Greeks and Syrians were moving into the neighborhood. So by 1930, all of the cities, I think all of the city's Jewish institutions were in the neighborhood except for the two that had left for northern climes, for the new suburbs. Now, of course, the 1930s is also the era of the Great Depression, and the Great Depression created a real crisis in Atlanta, lots of crises in cities all over the country, but created a real crisis in Atlanta as far as affordable housing goes, that neighborhoods were falling into disrepair, and people were having a hard time finding affordable places to live. And so how to solve the problem? The city develops a program that seeks to solve this problem through slum clearance and public housing. And both of these were, slum clearance, of course, was meant to fix the problem of neighborhoods, of dilapidated neighborhoods that were going into decline, that were regarded as a source of crime and disease, and that those spaces would be replaced, those homes would be replaced by subsidized public housing that was being built in a segregated way for Black and for white people. But the issue that would come to exacerbate this crisis for Atlanta's African-American population was that most often the slums that were cleared were neighborhoods that they lived in, affordable housing or barely affordable housing for African Americans that was, you know, on the private market. But they would be often replaced by public housing for white people only, as a matter of fact. If we look at this map for a moment, and to the north of Summerhill, just, I guess, to the left of the Jewish Institutions Square, you can see that there are two white rectangles, a white square and a white rectangle. Those squares were, as you can imagine, they had previously been part of Summerhill. They would have been, if you looked at this neighborhood 5 years previous, those squares would have been Black. But this is a moment where that part of town is being cleared for public housing. It would become Capitol Homes, and Capitol Homes was for white residents only. So Black residents are being cleared, and the amount of public housing that is being, and even housing on the private market that's available to them, is shrinking. And that creates a real housing crisis for them. And so often they are moving into these unrestricted neighborhoods in a city that is segregated, and the South Side is one of those neighborhoods. So the South Side is becoming increasingly racially mixed during this era where the city is trying to solve what it considers to be a problem of racial mixing by racially segregating the city. Another issue that the city is experiencing, and again, this is happening in cities all over the country, is a crisis in real estate value. People are unable to pay their mortgages. Banks are unwilling to loan money for people to either fix their homes or to buy a new home. And so the federal government, as part of the New Deal, establishes a set of agencies that try to help the housing market. And one of the things that the federal government does is it organizes the creation of a series of maps. So here is the map of Atlanta that was created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1938. And just to explain what these colors mean, I can imagine that you would understand that green is sort of at the highest level and red is at the lowest level. So these colors are meant to indicate to banks and to other mortgage loaning entities that these are the neighborhoods that are safest for a mortgage or any kind of loan. So if you live in a green colored neighborhood here and you want to take out a mortgage or you want to borrow money to fix your home, the bank is meant to understand this is safe for all kinds of loans. Green is the best. Blue is a little bit less, it's still fine, but not as good as green. It generally means that the people who live in these neighborhoods don't earn as much money. And maybe it means also that the homes are a little bit older and that maybe there's a little bit of commerce in those neighborhoods. Yellow means proceed with extreme caution. So you can still sometimes often get a loan in a neighborhood that's colored yellow, but the bank will scrutinize you. And red means that that if you are loaning money, you should really avoid loaning mortgage funds or any kind of monies to someone who wants to borrow money in what comes to be known as a red-lined neighborhood. So this is the redlining map of Atlanta. And just in case you've lost your orientation, here's the South Side. So the South Side is inside a red-lined area for a bunch of different reasons. One of those reasons is that the neighborhood is older, and generally speaking, the older homes are out of favor at this moment. And so the older homes make it harder to borrow money, the fact that there's commerce, but really it's about race. It explicitly stated in the explanation papers for this document, for this map, that any neighborhood that was majority African American was given red status, was redlined. And so, which doesn't mean that every single neighborhood that is red here is African American. Some of them are for poor or working class white people who live along industry, for instance, like Cabbagetown. But it doesn't matter if a neighborhood has Black homeowners or Black professionals or Blacks who are able to pay their mortgage and have done so successfully in the past. If there's a Black majority in a neighborhood, that neighborhood is redlined. And so this becomes a neighborhood that is increasingly economically unfeasible to live in. As a matter of fact, the explanation for the redlining of this neighborhood, one of the statements that was made in the analysis was that this neighborhood is really only worth loaning money for if the property is being purchased for Negro rental. And this is a really unregulated market, sometimes that is known to exploit its clients. And so this is something that creates an incentive for people who are already living on the South Side, who, if they are able to move to the North Side to purchase a home in the suburbs of the North Side, sometimes they do so and they sell their property, but sometimes they keep their property on the South Side and rent it out. And so this, creates more problems for this neighborhood, and it reduces the size of the Jewish population in this neighborhood. And this continues apace throughout the Depression and through the end of the Second World War. And at that point, after the Second World War in 1946, 1947, the Atlanta Community Council undertook a population study. And this is a map that Jeremy showed us a couple of weeks ago. And you can see here that they are trying to locate where Jews are living in Atlanta. And so it's clear from the sort of the smudges to the north and east that that is where the vast majority of Atlanta's Jews have moved to. Some of them a little bit closer in, but the area around Piedmont Park has a lot of Jewish families living in it. And the South Side still has a significant Jewish population. In 1946, there are, I think, around 500 Jewish households, according to that population study. But the population study recommends very sort of forthrightly that both residents and Jewish institutions that are still on the South Side, that they leave that area because they think that that area is where deterioration and group tensions, and I think that they mean tensions between Black people and white people, and group tensions are increasingly likely. And that's not the only thing that happens in 1946, besides this document that pushes Jewish institutions and Jewish residents who are paying attention to consider very strongly leaving the South Side. Another document that's released in 1946 is a planned highway map. This is the era where the federal government is starting to give cities and states money to start to plan interstate highways. And so Atlanta has the funding and it creates a plan. And the plan for this initial highway in 1946 puts this highway, the North-South Highway, directly through the part of the South Side where all of the Jewish institutions are. So it's not hard to imagine that, the writing is on the wall. And so those who are responsible for these institutions and for the real estate that is their major asset start to think really strongly about moving everything to the North Side. And so they do begin to do so. Starting in the early 1940s. By 1960, the neighborhood has already been cleared to a great extent for an urban renewal project. And by 1960, they're all gone. They've all moved to the South Side. And you can see here, so these are, the angle is different, but the streets are the same. So this is one is on the left is an aerial photograph of this neighborhood in 1940. And you can see that it's a grid and there are homes and institutions all around it. And then in 1966, just, 25 years later, it is stadium, parking lot, and highways. At this point, there are really only maybe a few dozen Jews who are still living in this part of town. The homes, so many of these homes have been cleared, but both to the east and the west, there are still people who are living in single family homes and apartments in more crowded ways. And these neighborhoods become primarily even more sort of densely populated, poor and African American. Because of the highways and the parking lots, these neighborhoods are cut off from the rest of the city, where you might have been able to walk downtown previously. Now you really can't. The stores along Georgia Avenue that they might have relied upon for groceries and other kinds of services, a movie theater, ice cream parlors, all gone. Or mostly gone. And not surprisingly, the real estate value has really declined. There were, as I said, some Jews and other white folks, the European Jews and some other white folks who were still in the neighborhood, but they're primarily present as landlords and as shopkeepers. And this relationship, this economic relationship by the mid-60s and certainly by 1970 had become a source of increasing tension between Jews in Atlanta and African Americans in Atlanta. So when Jews left Atlanta's South Side, they were, as I said before, they were responding to a wide range of incentives, so these pushes and pulls. And there's always the question of, you know, does the Jewish institution lead the way for moving a neighborhood to moving a Jewish community to a different neighborhood, or are they always following? And I think the answer, of course, is always yes. That that the community starts to leave, members start to leave, the institution follows, and then more members of the community who might still be in the previous place move as well. So these are, you know, some internal factors, but I think that we really need to, and we want to pay some significant attention to the external factor, which was, you know, the municipal planning that really cast a pall on a neighborhood like the South Side. And the important thing to note here is that municipal planning in Atlanta was unquestionably and, you know, inextricably tied to Jim Crow policy in the early to mid 20th century. And Jews in the South Side responded to this development by availing themselves of the economic and geographic mobility that was available to white people in Atlanta, and far less so to African Americans. And so I'll share one last picture, which I love. This is from Saul Beton's book about Orvis Shalom and this Sephardic history in Atlanta and throughout the United States. This is a 1963 performance. I assume it's by the Orvis Shalom Youth Group, performing a play of their own devising called South Side Story, which is an homage of, and, you know, working within the parameters of West Side Story, which had just come out about 5 years before. And if anyone here was in South Side Story or saw it or is familiar with the script, I would love to hear more about it, because I don't want to make assumptions. I don't know, you know, who are the sharks and who are the jets, and is that really how the play is structured? But it seems like it's, you know, it's just sort of an interesting way to think about that. This is a story about, certainly West Side Story, was about ethnic minorities in American cities laying claim and demanding claim to urban space. And that this was an iteration of that where an ethnic community is doing so by referring to a neighborhood that they had left behind, the space that they had previously claimed and lived in, and sort of thinking back upon it, perhaps romantically, from the suburbs. But I also think that it's important to keep in mind what was left behind, which was a neighborhood that had been sort of drained of all of its political power, without resources, and where racial and economic inequality were so intertwined. So I want to leave us on this one last thought before the Q&A, which is that it seems to me that American accounts of the history of the civil rights movement are often focused on the fight against Jim Crow's political expression, specifically, you know, the fight for the Black struggle for the rights of citizenship, the right to vote, the right to access to equal education, the right to access to public accommodations and things like that. But discussions of the era, it seems to me, too frequently pay less heed, insufficient heed, to the fact that Jim Crow is also an economic instrument, and it was applied through legal means and by commercial practices that were in the mainstream and were, in fact, legal. And that these policies and practices undermined Black upward mobility, They undermined Black intergenerational wealth accumulation, and they destabilized Black communities, like one can see when you study the history of Summerhill, right next to the South Side. And I wonder sometimes if American Jews' history of Jewish responses to the civil rights movement also tends to zoom a lot on politics, like many Americans do. And I think that there's really good reason for that, because there's no question that Jewish attitudes toward responses to the civil rights movement and their attitudes towards integration and political equality were far more liberal, far more open on the whole than that of other white Americans in the mid 20th century. And that certainly, you know, it is manifest in our city, in Atlanta itself. We heard about Jacob Rothschild a couple of weeks ago, but he was not by himself. There's also Cecil Alexander, who was tapped by Mayor Hartsfield in the 1950s to head up an interracial commission for helping the city to move forward towards integration. And he continued to do that kind of work and be an advocate for African Americans into, you know, the 1970s and 80s. A woman, Sherry Frank, who was a participant in these civil rights movements and was a partner with John Lewis in creating a Black Jewish coalition. So that the politics are important here. But I think also that Jews, American Jews sometimes pay insufficient attention to the history of the economic practices that exacerbated economic inequality. And if we focus on a neighborhood like the South Side, and there are other neighborhoods like it throughout the United States and certainly throughout the South, but if we focus on Atlanta's South Side, it helps us to recognize that when Atlanta's Jewish communities, mid-century Jewish communities, decamped for the northern suburbs and for these new neighborhoods, they made economic choices that manifested the racism that was a central component to so many American institutions, political and economic institutions throughout the United States. And even if and when Atlanta's Jews held notably liberal attitudes towards racial integration, we might still reflect on the role that Atlanta's Jews played, even if inadvertently and unintentionally, in the widening racial economic inequality in this country that we are currently in the midst of having such a heated and important conversation about.
Thank you so much, Marni, for your presentation and sharing your research and insight. We got a lot of comments during your presentation about this kind of like nostalgia for this South Side. You know, people talking about families owned grocery shops and butcher stores and attended AA under Epstein and were born on first or second, third home plate, so to speak, at Piedmont Hospital. Can you talk about this zeitgeist and why this like kind of shtetl atmosphere is so nostalgic today?
Well, I understand the nostalgia for sure. I mean, it's the old neighborhood, right? And I've heard so many people say they were born on third base, which is charming, but I don't know if it's actually physically possible. But it's true that there is a lot of nostalgia for the neighborhood in ways that I find both heartwarming, but sometimes a little bit baffling, because it is a nostalgia for something that has been erased. Like there's just nothing there anymore that would indicate that previous presence. And so it's, as someone who's from New York and where that nostalgia actually has a built environment upon which to sort of plant itself, that disconnect is always sort of fascinating and kind of heartbreaking to me. Because there is simultaneously this interest in remembering fondly the stores and the homes and the schools and all of that, while there's also this very Atlanta mindset of looking forward towards the future. So in my research, I think that it's fair to say that from what I can tell, this 1963 Orva Shalom performance of South Side Story, it's one of the few indications that I had found in the archives that Atlanta's Jews who had moved north were looking back south at all. So that's interesting to me. But I love hearing I love hearing people's stories, and actually would love to hear more of those stories. And if anyone wants to email me, and we can set up a Zoom interview, because I want to know more.
Yeah, Marni, that would be great. I can include your email in the follow-up
Please do.
when I reach out to everybody. Great. And I forgot to mention, you should definitely check the chat, because there's some leads on identifying people in this picture of the South Side Story. So take a look there. You might find some people to reach out to for that.
Awesome.
We got a couple of questions here also about your research techniques. Street name changes is infamous in Atlanta, especially when you get to segregated areas. That is still kind of carried over to today. And also your Georgia Avenue project. Did this kind of tie together? How did that come about?
Well, as far as my research techniques, a lot of my research really comes out of looking at historical maps. That's particularly important in a neighborhood like this one, where you would never know that there were houses in a place that's now just a sea of parking. And so I'm working with other sort of digital librarians and people who do a lot of technical stuff with maps and computers to sort of overlay old maps on new maps. And so I can figure out where these places were and where people lived. And so the image that I showed of all of the Jewish institutions and where they were in a place that's now just like the knot of the interchange, that's how I did that. And I also use things like the census and city directories just to figure out who was where and when. So that's my research. As far as my Georgia Avenue project, so this is, those of you who haven't seen it, this was a project that I did with using a grant that was given to people who are doing research on the Summerhill neighborhood in particular. And my project partner and I were taking note that Georgia Avenue, which up until about 5 years ago had just been kind of abandoned, that it was becoming gentrified, that now it's being redeveloped, and now there's like my favorite pizza places there, and there's a really delicious bakery and a brewery and fancy barbecue, and there's going to be a lot of restaurants there. And so my project partner and I decided that we would use that street and the way that it was changing right now, this very second, as a way of thinking about all of the changes that it's been through since really 1900. And so we go back all the way to the 19-teens or so, when the street was established as a commercial hub for the South Side neighborhoods, and sort of follow just that one very, like a tiny little lens of microhistory on this one street as a way of thinking about the damage that redlining did, about immigrant neighborhoods, and the ways that immigrants and white ethnic Atlantans moved into and out of. We also were thinking about the African American neighborhoods there, and I didn't mention, but it's worth pointing out that up until the 1950s or so, Summerhill had been also very much a mixed class neighborhood, where there were a lot of Black middle class homeowners. And they were also pushed out by the same incentives that other Atlantans, that Jewish Atlantans and other white Atlantans were, but they could only move to a very few suburbs to the west of the downtown area. So, but they moved too. And so sort of watching the neighborhood change because of both local community decisions, municipal policies, and federal programs. So I hope that answers your question.
I think we have time for one more question. I want to be mindful of everybody's time, and I always kind of like to look towards the future for the last question. And so there's been a lot of, you touched on this a little bit, gentrification in the area. What do you see as the future of this neighborhood? Is the Beltline going through those neighborhoods? I can't remember. I don't know.
No, the Beltline goes due south, but not that far south. I guess it's probably about a half a mile to the south of Georgia Avenue, maybe a little bit more. So before I say anything, I want to say that I am a historian and not a future prognosticator, and I am really bad at predicting the future. So take it with a grain of salt. It's hard to know what's going to happen to this neighborhood in the future. Since the Olympics, there have been real efforts, sort of multiple periods of effort toward redevelopment of the neighborhood, gentrification, and so on. And right now, up until the pandemic, really, I think it's going to be really hard to tell what the current economic crisis is going to do to housing and real estate in the city. Up until then, the neighborhood really seemed like it was going to be redeveloped both by Georgia State and by a private developer, Carter Industries, a private developer that's redeveloping Georgia Avenue. And a lot of more expensive homes are being built in the area. Taxes are going up, and all of this is working to push longtime African-American residents who have been the majority of the neighborhood for decades, push them out because they can no longer afford the rent and the taxes and so on. What happens now? I mean, I feel like the economy is in such flux that I am frightened to try and make any kind of prediction. But if Georgia State continues to redevelop the area, and they have plans to build, I think, in addition to the stadium that's currently there, the old Turner Field, they're going to build 2 more sports facilities in the area. And also student housing, and Carter is going to be rebuilding, building some more shops and offices, and I think also some housing as well. If all of that proceeds apace, then this neighborhood is going to, in some ways, look a lot more like it used to, in that it will be mixed use. And it will have a demographic mix. And I think that they're also going to do their best to recreate the grid that had been taken away by all of the parking lots. But I think that it will also be a neighborhood that is simply unaffordable for people who struggle to access market rate housing. And that this is going to continue to be an issue. And this is certainly not just an Atlanta issue. This is an American problem. But the South Side is one of the most, is a particularly, focused site of it right now.
Great. Thank you so much, Marni. And thank you all so much for your interest in the Summer Speaker Series presented by the Breman Museum. Just a quick reminder, I'm going to shortly send you all a follow-up email that will include a survey. Please take a few minutes to fill that out, as well as some helpful links to future programs and also the recording of this program, which will be made available in the near future. Again, please visit our website for future programs, and I hope you all have a wonderful Shabbat and a wonderful weekend. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Good job.
Thank you, Jeremy.
See you all again in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marni.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank all of you. Thank you so much
Wonderful
for being here.
Thank you.
So please email me. Jeremy's going to give you my email. Email me if you have any more questions. I could
Yes, I will.
talk about the South Side.
Thank you.
all the way
Thank
along.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be careful what you ask for.
I know.
Thanks from an old Magnolia who lives in New Jersey. Love seeing everyone.
Jeremy, when will that program be available again?
It'll be up sometime early next week. I'll send you the link to our YouTube channel where you can download it, or you can watch it next week.
Oh,
Great, thank you.
thank you.
Mhm.
Remember to send
Thank you.
Marnie.
Thank you all. I will. I'll include that.
Jeremy,
Thank you.
great program.
Okay.
Oh,
Jake.
great. I'm glad you all enjoed.
Have a great weekend. I miss you guys.
Bye. Shabbat shalom.
Yeah, I miss seeing you all.
We just
It's
gotta
good seeing you, Jackie.
Good being seen.
Good answer.
Yeah, but not.
I miss you too, Mark.
Jeremy, what is the topic of the next meeting?
Oh, the next meeting topic is about Savannah's early colonial history, about the origins of their community, the Sephardic heritage.
Oh, large Jewish community in Savannah at one time.
Yes,
Oh,
please
yeah,
keep
yeah.
us on the email list.
It's the origins of
She
the
grew up
Jewish
here in Atlanta
community in
too,
the South.
her family. And Bonnie Fogg is on there. Bonnie Cook.
Bonnie Cook.
Yeah,
We like her.
Jeremy, will we stay on the email list now?
If you go to our website, you can, or when you fill out the survey, you can add your email there and we'll include it on the email list.
Okay, great. This was fabulous. I'm very homesick.
Yeah.
Jeremy,
Oh yeah, well, we got lots of programming for you to keep you busy.
Podber. I
Keeping you
actually
busy.
have some memorabilia I might send down to the museum from my
Oh, okay.
mom. So
Great.
I'll
Yeah,
send you a
please reach
picture.
out to me.
Okay.
Sounds great. I look forward to
Okay.
that.
Take
Thank
care. Have
you.
a good Shabbos.
Jeremy,
Jeremy,
You too. Yes.
Mikveh Israel is celebrating its 287th anniversary in Savannah tomorrow.
Oh, great.
It'll be YouTube. We'll be reading from one of the old Torahs. Honoring Herman Myers, who was the first Jewish mayor in Savannah, and the second,
Okay.
I understand, in Georgia. And anybody who wants to watch,
I can't close.
you can do it by YouTube.
Great. Thanks for sharing
Okay.
that.
Look,
Appreciate
if you
that.
go to
Congratulations on the
mikvahisrael.org,
anniversary.
yeah. If you go to mikvahisrael.org, you can get the link.
Great. Thank you.
Hey, Jeremy, so there's
Should
a
record that
lot
for
of
the archives.
Jeremy, can I ask a question?
Marnie, I want to ask you a question.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Paul.
Can I just quickly ask Jeremy a question? The chat, how can does that get saved? Can I?
Oh, yeah, it does get saved.
Marnie,
Yeah,
it's
I can
Rabbi
send you
Joe.
the
I
chat.
just saved it. I'm going to send it to you in just 2 minutes.
There are people in there I need to speak with right away.
Marnie,
I've just saved it to a Word doc. You'll get it in about 2 minutes.
Thank you. All right, Paul Katz, you had a question.
Yeah, Marnie, hi. How can I copy or capture that last photograph of the Orbe Shalom musical?
Do you own Saul Betton's book about Orve Shalom?
No, I don't.
Okay, well, I mean, I can send it to you. I'm not the book, but I can send this image to you. It comes from that book. I can send you the citation and the image itself.
Marnie, Albert Pinto, your talk was very interesting. There were a few dates that you had not precise, and I don't know if you know Maslia has done a map of the area.
I mentioned that map early in the talk. Yes.
Okay, but I wanted to be sure you were in touch with him.
Oh yeah, of course.
Some of your dates are not exactly precise. I moved from the South Side as a child in approximately 1940. Could have been 39. And we moved to Boulevard. I lived at 444 Boulevard.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the families that were on the South Side had already moved to the North at that time.
Right.
And I just Leslie can help you with dates more precisely than I can.
Yeah, no, I think that the 1946 Jewish population map makes that clear, that by the 1940s, certainly the majority of Jews lived outside of the South Side.
Our house
So I think
is,
that's exactly right.
Your presentation, it was fantastic.
Thank you.
Marni. Yes, Leon Tuck speaking.
Hey, Leon.
Hello, Leon.
I lived across the street from Siegel's Market. You showed a picture of that on Washington Street. I lived directly across the street.
Oh, you did?
And there were a lot of Washington Street people in this today.
I am not.
So hello, everybody.
And those of you, I interviewed Mr. Tuck. If you look at my Georgia Avenue, if you Google Georgia Avenue, Marni Davis, you'll find my history project. I interviewed Leon Tuck, and there's a little fragment of that interview in the digital project that I did. So you can hear Leon Tuck talking about going to the dentist.